Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's BECC webinar. We are thrilled to be hosting today's webinar, and I personally love the topic. Today's actually our first BECC webinar of the year. We've had a couple of workshops, but this is the first, more traditional webinar that we're hosting, and we're thrilled to have Janet Swim with us today. Today's topic is the devil is in the details, the effects of variation in policies on climate change policy preferences. And it comes very timely because this year's BECC conference happening in November will be about reimagining the future. And a lot of that has to do with our new administration and the new policies that will likely be rolled out this year. So to get started, my name is Ruben Sussman. I direct the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, or ACEEE. More importantly, I co-chair the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference, and today's webinar is brought to you by the BECC Conference. So the conference is happening this year. It's virtual again, November 8th to 10th, 2021. We are planning a small in-person component, but we're not sure exactly what form that'll take yet, and we're still working things out with the way the pandemic is going. But I did want to note that early bird rates are open now and for a limited time. So if you're thinking of going to the conference, take advantage of the best pricing you can and register today. It's going to be a very interesting, I've already taken a look at some of the submitted talks. We have a fantastic keynote, Michael Pollan, which we'll announce in an upcoming email. So head over to the conference website and register when you have the chance. And of course, we have to give a huge shout out and thank you to our sponsors for this year's conference. These sponsors are responsible not just for the conference itself, but also for this webinar. So without these sponsors, this webinar would not go on. National Grid, LADWP, AEG, Guidehouse, ADM, Apprise, Illume, and Energy Code ACE. Thank you very much. And if you are a sponsor and you want 200 eyeballs on your logo every month or so, then send me an email and we can connect you. And I also want to mention that, this is our monthly webinar / workshop, and next month's workshop will be presented by Energy Code ACE on June 17th, and it's changing behavior to support energy and carbon reduction through energy codes. So we'll talk about energy codes, the California example. The speaker, or I should say workshop facilitator, will be Gina Rada. These small interactive workshops are a little bit different than the webinars in that there's limited enrollment. We haven't opened up enrollment yet, but you can head over to the website to learn more about what will be offered at the workshop. And we'll probably open it up next week, so stay tuned for that. We'll have limited enrollment, so sign up as soon as you get the email. Now, let's get into some webcast platform tips for today. Your screen is customizable. You may have noticed this already. You can use the various widgets across the bottom. The size of each window can be adjusted by clicking on it and dragging the corner to either increase or decrease the size. You can also play around right now. You can click through the available widgets at the bottom of your screen to add or remove them from your view. And you and all the rest of the attendees are in listen-only mode. In fact, that's really the only mode there is. You won't be able to talk with out loud on this webinar, but please submit your questions through the Q&A widget at the bottom at any time during the webcast. Presenters, as in the presenter, Janet Swim, will respond to your questions at the last 20 minutes. So I'll be curating those questions and asking them. If you can't get your question answered for some reason, Janet can reply to your question by email if you send her a message by email. And the last thing I want to mention, this is new to this webinar, we'll have the chat feature enabled. There's going to be a group chat button down at the bottom there. Go in there, and as the presentation is going on, you can chat about what your thoughts are. Add your comments. What are you thinking about as you hear this webinar? And I'll try to keep an eye on that. If anything interesting, I can mention it to Janet at the end of the session. But mostly, I'm going to be watching the Q&A for questions. So if you have anything really important to ask, put it in the Q&A. Otherwise, please do share your thoughts and ideas with the rest of the audience throughout the webinar through the chat feature. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to present today's speaker. Dr. Janet Swim will be talking about the devil is in the details, the effects of variation in policies on climate change policy preferences. Dr. Swim is a professor of psychology at Penn State. She served as the chair for the first American Psychological Association Task Force on Psychology and Climate Change, and is currently helping on the new task force. She also chairs the Sustainability Council at Penn State, and she can tell you more about that. We're very delighted to have Dr. Swim on today's webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to telling you the research that I'm going to cover today. It's some of our recent research. It is not published yet, although we've gotten revises and resubmits on all of them. So we're in the process of working on that. So any comments you have would be great. Any questions would be wonderful. The research, I also want to give credit to that Nathan Geiger has been working on me side by side with this, and he deserves a lot of credit for the contribution to this research. And Nathan Geiger is at Indiana University, so I want to acknowledge this. So I forgot there's this page. So I'm going to start with, actually, I'm going to get to the 3 studies, but what I'd like to start with is actually something that I encountered about 10 years ago. And this was at the point when I was just starting to immerse myself in climate change research. And before that, I had done a lot of research on intergroup relationships, but I got inspired to start working on climate change. And Penn State wanted to support social sciences and climate change because we have a huge climate change group of people on campus, and they're very supportive about all of our research. And they said that I could invite a speaker in, and I picked John Krosnick. John Krosnick is one of the first people to have done any polling data on climate change. And I was surprised by the data he presented, and it's still somewhat surprising for people as well. So I'm thinking that you might be surprised by some of it as well. So there are certain data points that I remember from 10 years ago, and I'm going to share some of those. So one of the first things he presented at the beginning of his talk was that how many people, what % of the people in the United States believe that the Earth's temperature is probably increasing over the past 100 years. So those are on 2010. So he presented the data that he first collected in 1998 and 2010. They've continued to collect data, and it goes to 2020. So when you look at this data, what I found fascinating was that people, 80% of the population, way back in 1998, believed this was true, and they still believe it's true, and it's consistently true. And so there's a dip there a little bit, but it's around 80% of the population have believed this, seems like forever. And you look at some other data sets, and you think about some other things that could be reported. And those would be, let's see, what's the next one? So the next one is, let's move forward. So the % of Americans who believe that is somewhat serious. So you might think that's happening, but it's not serious. But no, they've thought it's serious forever. As far as 1998 is forever. And it will hurt future generations, suggesting that they understood some of the moral dimensions about climate change. So most people, again, think it's going to hurt future generations. And so when you look at this data, there's this consistency. But you can also look at it from the Yale climate change data. So this is data that they collect county by county across the United States, asking them various questions about climate change. And across the United States, this yellow is kind of in the middle of this bar. So the yellow is about 60 to 70%. And across the United States, then you get a majority. It's not anywhere near the 80%, but it is still above 50%. So 60 to 70% think climate change is happening. They're worried about it. They think there's going to be harm to future generations, the same sort of questions. And they want people to do something about it. So the darker is even higher. So you get a strong % of the people want to regulate climate change as a pollutant. They want to support carbon taxes, and they want to do this utilities produce 20% of the electricity from renewables. So when I see this, I think about things, and in my cynical brain, I come and I think about the protests that have been occurring and increasing. And so we spend a lot of our effort trying to convince people of something that they already believe. It's the hot mess. We need to protect people. It's not cool. And so we do a lot of this effort trying to focus in on some of the things that people already acknowledge are true and most people acknowledge are true. So one of the questions is, with so much support, why do we struggle with enacting? So there's a series of things that psychologists have done to try and understand that. So some of it is not so much do they answer affirmatively to these questions, but rather it's whether they prioritize these sorts of policies over other policies. And so one of the things then is, I categorize these into 3 different areas, is that climate change is unobtrusive. In fact, when John Krosnick was there, he talked about how people look outside of their window and decide whether or not climate change is happening or not. That's what he said way back in 2010. It's an intrusive problem. We don't see it. It's distal, and distal in terms of future. It's distal geographically, perceptually. People tend to report that. It tends to lack a moral imperative, although people are getting more and more involved and endorsing or in seeing there's a moral imperative, but it lacks it in some sense relative to other crises that we might be encountering. And the big thing is that people talk about political polarization, that we are, well, while most people think we should do something, there's still this polarized world. But these sort of what I would call individual person level explanations are really only part of the puzzle. So one of the things that happens if you have these person level effects, you try and change the person, or you address those person resistance. And that's worth doing, and I don't want to downplay that too much. What I want to, though, is talk about how I think we should be paying more attention to the policies themselves. So just as an example, if you think about this polarization, and here we have our red states and our blue states across the United States, and we look at carbon pricing, and they are divided. And since you take the most blue states, they're more likely to have carbon pricing. But it's not that all the blue states do it. And so some of the blue states will endorse carbon pricing, and some will not. And in fact, many will not. So it's not just a red state, blue state thing, something else is going on. Or you look at the electricity portfolio standards, and those who require a percent of, again, energy from renewables. And you look across the country and you see most states have some version of that. And so what you then see is that many of the red states are actually endorsing these portfolio standards. So there's something different going on. Political polarization is part of it, but something else. So in some cases, the blue states are not endorsing them, and other things, the red states are endorsing them. So what we wanted to do was to spend some time thinking about different types of policies. And there's actually a wide range of policies that you can think about with climate change. And these are just a list of 10 different topic areas. And within each one of these, there's a different sort of policy that can emerge. So Project Drawdown is something that Penn State is paying a lot of attention to. They've invested money in Project Drawdown. Drawdown is, if you haven't heard of it, is 100 different topic areas or places we should invest to draw down our CO2s. And then they rank order them in terms of gigatons of carbon dioxide reduction. And here's just the top 10 of them. My point here is that there are many different things that we can do. What we're interested in was, why are some policies preferred over other policies? And I gave you 2 of them, but there's a whole list of them. This is at the within person level analysis. So this isn't why some people want to support it versus other people don't. What this is when you take one person, which policy do they prefer over other policies? That, in some sense, is an important thing to think about in terms of, you've seen that in behavioral change, that there are different sorts of behaviors that are going to be more able to reduce CO2 than others, but you pick things that are most likely, people are most likely to change. And so you could have a behavior that's going to do a great amount of change, but it's not necessarily going to go anywhere because people are not going to do that behavior. So you can think about that with policies. There's some policies that will have a great impact, but if nobody's going to support it and it's not going to be passed, it doesn't matter. So you have to kind of think about both the extent to which a policy is going to effectively make a difference and the likelihood that you're going to get stakeholder investment in it. And the general public is one of those stakeholders. So what we are asking is, what are the attributes that make one policy more appealing than another policy? And then why do these attributes matter? So we have a couple of studies that have been looking into that. And one of the things we wanted to do was unconfound the policy attributes. So you could take the list of policy attributes, and you could have people rank order them, but they vary on so many different attributes that it's really hard to know. So a lot of people support funding renewable energy research, and is that because and is it because they think they should invest in industry? And so there are lots of different attributes tested, and they really support renewable energy, but support the testing of them. I give some more examples like that, but we wanted to unconfound those attributes, experimental study. And in that experimental study, we focused on 3 particular types of attributes. One was, how are the policies trying to create? Who is the policy trying to change? And what changes are the policies targeting? And I'll go over each one of those to make those clear. But there are 2 studies. We used in-Turk samples, and they reported their support on 8 policies. So it's a within-person design, so that's why we can tell which ones they like better than others. And so we're trying to predict, it's not really the rank ordering, but it is the relative preferences from one policy over the other based upon those attributes. So this first one is, how are they trying to create change? So incentives versus disincentives, this is a pretty common set of attributes that people have researched. So Drew and Vandenberg did some review of people's support for different climate change policies. Atari has done a paper on it. I think Linda Stegg has as well. But generally, people like policies that have carrots. So they like the incentives more than they like policies that use disincentives. So we predicted that that would be true as well. There's also who. So are they targeting businesses, or are they targeting individuals? So you can think about trying to get LEED certified business buildings, or you can help people make their homes more energy efficient. So is your policy targeting the businesses or the individuals? And one of the things you should see is that they are not completely comparable. And this is the unconfounding of things. One is the percent of Americans who thought the federal government should require companies to pay greenhouse gases they emit. And the other one is the percent of Americans who believe that the U.S. government should increase taxes on electricity to cause people to use less energy. And so the difference here is you're targeting an industry and you're targeting an individual. There are other differences between them as well, but if this is a pretty close comparison, and it suggests that people would prefer the companies to pay taxes than to have a tax then result in something that becomes a penalty for people. Because the more they use, the more they have to pay. So it suggests people would prefer to target businesses over the individuals. But you can also look at it and some other things. This targeting may vary by how. So here's 2 other questions. So we have the percent of Americans who believe the U.S. government should give companies tax breaks to produce electricity, and the percent of Americans who believe the government should pay part of the cost for people who put solar panels on their homes. And so when you do that, there's a much greater similarity between the 2. In fact, this is 80% over here, and this is more like 70%. So it becomes much more even when you look at these things. So we were interested in both the how and the who, but thought, well, there might be some interaction between the 2 of them. The third is the what. So this sort of what we are looking at is energy supply versus energy demand. So a fair number of policies are trying to change where our energy comes from, where is it produced from. So having more renewable energy and less fossil fuel energy. So it's targeting the supply of the energy, as opposed to targeting energy efficiency, where we're trying to use less energy. So we're trying to reduce the demand. And I put the pictures up like this because you can do this in individuals, reduce in the home or put panels on the house, and you can do it, the demand in businesses or the demand for in in businesses, demand and supply in businesses. So you can cross them. They're not, oftentimes these attributes are not systematically crossed when you look across actual policies. So what we were trying to do in our research then is to unconfound them. So we created we looked for 8 policies, and then we wrote them in a way that emphasized whether they were incentives or disincentives, whether they targeted businesses or individuals, whether they were about supply or demand. And we pilot tested all these in the way we wrote them so that people would see these top 4 as incentives and bottom 4 as disincentives, and continuing along these different dimensions. And the labels here are only part of what we gave them. We gave them this sort of broad label, and then we gave them like a 2 or 3 sentences to describe each one of them. And we asked people to rate. They didn't see these labels here. That was the pilot study. But here we gave them these labels here, and they said, how much do you support it? So we had 3 different questions about the extent to which they would support these different types of policies. And so what you find is that people prefer policies with incentives over disincentives. So that's the thing that other people have said, and we replicate. People also tend to these are all significant. So they do prefer supply over demand. But the thing that is also interesting, though, is there's an interaction, what we thought there could have been, between the how, the incentives and disincentives, versus the who. And we've been starting to call this not out of my bank account. So sometimes these are different from each other, and sometimes they're the same in the 2 different studies. But what's consistently found is when you get to the disincentives, people don't like them if they're targeting individuals. They're much more tolerant of disincentives to businesses than they are to individuals. So it's the same sort of policies in terms of whether it's targeting supply or demand, but it's a dislike of them when it's the individual and disincentives. So the next part of the study we did was we wanted to say, well, why do these attributes matter? And we thought about that in terms of what if people think the consequences are of these different policies, and can we predict those consequences based upon the attributes? So when you look through people on the web, people's response to different climate change policies, you can look through them and find people who object to them. So there's this book, False Alarms: How Climate Change Panic Costs trillions, hurts the poor, and fails to fix the problem. And then you've got these pictures of wind turbines. They're really loud. And Western PA, you can find these posters about don't kill coal with EPA. And this was back when Obama was in office, and don't kill it. So there's protect our jobs. And so you have these objections. But what I think is interesting about them is perhaps clearly over here is that it fails to fix the planet, so that suggests they're not very effective. It hurts the poor, and that suggests that it's not good for people. And it costs us trillions of dollars, which suggests it's probably not good for the economy. But you can also go on the other side, the people who support it. And so this is an example of the Citizen Climate Lobby. They have a fee and dividends. So companies pay fees based upon the amount of emissions they have. Those dividends are then distributed to the general public. But now on their webpage, they have arguments for it. So they have that we can, with this policy, they project that we can be net zero by 2020. So that means it's effective, that it's going to put money in your pockets, have a strong economy, and keep businesses healthy, suggesting it's good for the economy. And it creates jobs and saves lives. And so that's a social component. So again, you get the environment, economic, and social. And so looking through those, you can think about those in terms of sustainability, the 3 pillars of sustainability. So one pillar is the economic, social, and environmental. And so what we were interested in is, what do people anticipate are the consequences? So we asked them, to what extent do you think this policy will benefit people? And to what extent will it harm people? And we took the difference between those. That gives us the net benefits to people. and the economy. What extent is the benefits to the economy and harm to the economy, and took the difference between that. And then we had the extent of benefits to the environment. And we call that the effectiveness. We did ask them the harm, but very few people, like 10% of the people, said there was any harm for all of them. So it's, Nathan did the factor analysis, this within-person factor analysis that supported these three different pillars at the individual level. And so we created these measures to represent these three different pillars. So what we find then is, if you want to explain why people like the supply policy more than the demand policy, you can see that they think there's more environmental benefits for the supply than the demand. They think that it's better for the people, and they think that it has a more positive economic impact. The thing that's interesting also, you can see that it's mostly all of them that people think it has an environmental, they're more certain about the environmental impact than they are about these others. But it is still the case that the supply is greater than the demand on each one of these. I kind of bring up this linear relationship here because oftentimes we will focus in on climate change policies and how they are going to be effective and to take care of all these problems that we are anticipating from climate change. And so we're saying it's a great effectiveness for protecting the environment. But we need to be thinking about these other pillars as well, that people are not as certain that they're good for people and the economy as they are about the environment. But back to the reason why I was interested in it is the case that their anticipated consequences to these three different pillars of sustainability are different based upon supply and demand. And this is a model then that's trying to connect it then to the policy support. So supply versus demand, which I just showed you in the other graphs, and this positive number here means that it's more effective, it has more net positive impact, supply does, and more net social impact than demand. And then these things are then correlated over here with policy support. And that's the pathway. Supply versus demand affects these impacts, which then subsequently affect policy support. And so they can explain the tendency for people to prefer supply over demand. Then the other is trying to explain this not out of my bank account. And so we asked those same questions. You can see that the pattern of these bar graphs follow the same pattern of the policy support, that there's not a lot of difference over here in the incentive, but the difference is in the disincentives, that they think that targeting the individuals is going to be less effective, have a lot fewer environmental benefits, and targeting them, particularly with disincentive, is going to really have a low sense of it's not good for people. We didn't find this interaction with the economic impacts. People in general across both businesses and individuals think the incentives will have a better economic impact than disincentives. Though we were interested in this interaction because we wanted to explain this not out of my bank account effect. So putting that into the same model, what we have here is reporting it. So this top part here is one of the graphs, and that's about effectiveness. And the bottom part with the social impact is the other graph. The A is when it's disincentives, and the B is when it's incentives. So you can see this number, 10.72, is bigger than the 3.88. And that means it's much stronger for businesses over individuals for disincentives. So this is basically, these are the graphs. And then these effectivenesses then end up supporting the policy support. So what this model is saying is that NOMBA effect, the reason for the NOMBA effect, can be explained by people's expectations about the impact on the environment and the social impacts. So NOMBA, if you take following that pathway down, NOMBA is a problem in the sense that people don't like disincentive policies that target individuals. But we also are kind of curious about the possibility that NOMBA could provide an opportunity. And we were thinking about it in terms of the opportunity is that it creates people's attention to those science messages that could be used to promote policies. So another line of research that I work on is climate change messaging, climate change science messaging. How can you communicate that science better? And so we thought, in some sense, the NOMBA effect might increase people's attention to it. So if you think about something that's threatening, and that's I may have to pay some penalty if I don't reduce my energy, that becomes some sort of threat, then you might pay more attention to the information. This comes out of also with the dual process models of persuasion. In the dual process models of persuasion, they say a policy is outcome relevant if it affects one of your goals. And when it's outcome relevant, you pay attention to persuasive messages. And when you pay attention to the persuasive messages, you are more able to differentiate between strong and weak arguments. So as you pay attention to it, the type of argument you give is really important, because people will support something with a strong argument and not support it with a weak argument when it's outcome relevant. When it's not outcome relevant, the strength of the argument doesn't matter. Basically, people say, oh, it's fine. So some of the early research in the dual process models comes out of what's called the elaboration likelihood model. And the people were given a policy that students were asked if they would support exams necessary to graduate. And it became, when it was applied now to the students then, it was outcome relevant. If it was for students later, it was not outcome relevant. So when it's outcome relevant, the strength of the argument mattered. When it was for students 10 years after them, the strength of the argument didn't matter. So we thought that the NOMBA effect may be also outcome relevant, in that if it's applied to me as an individual as opposed to a business or somebody else, it's outcome relevant. So if it's applied to me, and in that case, I may be paying a lot more attention to that message. And with that, we were interested in whether that meant they would be paying attention to science messages. Science messages could be pretty complicated as part of what we're interested in. And that's one of the difficulties with providing climate science information, is somebody has to pay enough attention to understand it. And if they don't care about it, they're not going to pay attention to it. But if they care about it, they might pay attention to it. So that's where we're thinking the NOMBA might be an opportunity. So we have our initial pilot study we did, and these were with psych students. And we told them that we wanted their opinion about paying a green fee for community solar. And actually, when we first did this study, Penn State was proposing this idea that we wanted to put community solar up on our campus. They're looking for different sources of financing for it. And one of them would have been for students to help contribute something with a fee. And so they already have other fees on campus. The computer fee, they have a fee that was implemented to renovate the gym, one of the many gyms on campuses. And so they already pay some fees. And so it's like, maybe they could pay a green fee. And some universities have these green fees for other things as well. So at that time, Penn State was actually thinking about it. So in that case, when the students were asked, we wanted to ask them, how much do you support a green fee that put in community solar at Penn State? That became an outcome relevant condition. The other half of the students in the study, though, were told that people in California, they're at this fitness and yoga club. This fitness and yoga club is across California, and we just made that up. I don't know if it really is one or not, but we told them there's this fitness and yoga club. They're thinking about investing in community solar, and they're going to ask the members of the fitness and yoga club to pay a fee to help contribute to the cost of it. So that was our outcome relevant, whether it was you were paying for it or somebody else in California was paying for it, but it's the same policy between the two of them. So when you tell them just that, people, the students would say, we're not really, they're kind of neutral, actually. 0 is a neutral point. They're neutral in the support for it. But if it was California, they could pay for it. So this is the not out of my bank account. It's okay for them, not so much for them. Then we gave them what we're calling a weak science message. And this is kind of a typical science message. That's very what I call surface level, doesn't really add a lot. So to what people already think, the planet is getting warmer. We already actually know that 80% of the population thinks that. Polar bears are dying, so this is the effects are somewhere else and it's on animals. And we need renewable energy. And so would you support this? Now, this we need renewable energy is important because there's no connection between this, the warming and polar bears dying, and renewable energy. Now, if you know about climate change, you see that connection. But if you don't know about it, it's not really a strong message. And this is kind of like when people are trying to convince people about climate change is a problem, they just keep saying there's more and more of a problem, but it really doesn't explain the science. So when we gave them this sort of weak message, it didn't matter. So they still would prefer people in California to pay it than they themselves to pay it. So then we tried to, this is in the same study, so we also did what I call strong science messaging. And I mentioned that I was working with people at zoos and aquariums. So we worked with about 170 zoos and aquariums to help interpreters provide science messaging. And this is with Frameworks Institute. And they did a lot of research on how do you present science messages to have people best understand it. And so to talk about these different steps. And the first is to present a value that most people agree with. And so you don't present that the planet is melting and polar bears are dying. You don't put that first in a sense that people will run away from it. You present it with a value that engages them and wants them to pay attention. Then you give them science information, but when you don't give them surface science information, but you don't give them a lot of details either. What's important in that science information is that you use metaphors to explain the science, and you explain the science process. And then you connect that science process to some impact. And that impact is these things are connected to the solutions. So you end with a solution that then addresses the causes that you've just explained. So just as an example, we start with one of the things they talk about is responsible management. So the idea that we as a people are responsible for managing the resources that we have on this planet. And we're responsible for it. They often bring in protection for future generations as well. We need to manage these resources. Most people believe it. It also tends to be consistent with conservative values. And so you start with that, and people kind of going, yeah, okay. And then you move to the first metaphor, which is regular and rampant CO2. And so this is getting at people's confusion about natural versus human-caused climate change. And you say, well, yeah, there is natural. This is that, well, there's little leaves there. And it's regular. We regularly produce CO2, and it's good for the planet. We need it. But we're creating rampant CO2 with factories producing more CO2. And what they're doing is creating a heat-trapping blanket around the planet, warming the planet. And they use this heat-trapping blanket metaphor as opposed to greenhouse gases, because in their work, people get confused about greenhouses. Greenhouses are good. They don't know how greenhouses work, but they know how a blanket works. So you tell them the blanket's getting thicker and thicker, and then you connect that to some impact. And at zoos and aquariums, it was about the animals in front of you, but in our research, we then connected it to human impacts, in a sense, through ticks. So ticks are surviving longer. And in our second study, we also talked about dairy farms and for dairy farmers. And so ticks are surviving when it gets warmer. They're spreading Lyme disease, and it's causing problems, this warmth. And one solution is solar panels, because it goes back and addresses this rampant CO2. So it's important to connect that back over. So this is a strong science message. And we gave them the strong science message, and that made a difference. And just in case you're wondering, because it took me a long time to say that relative to the weak science message, the messages were the same length. So when you give people a strong science message, that was enough to overcome the NOMBA effect. And that was in our pilot study. So in our next study, we wanted to see whether or not it went through the elaboration, the likelihood model. So we had them list their thoughts after the policy, and they rated how favorable their thoughts were for that policy. And you basically get the same sort of effect. When it's other people, the thoughts it didn't matter what you said. if you said anything or didn't matter. It was the same level of favorability, but it was directed towards Penn State students. They were more favorable in the strong condition than the other ones with the strong science. So it actually, again, there's this differentiation. And so again, in these sort of mediation models, strong science messages led to more favorable thoughts when it was relevant, it's Penn State, not when it was in California. And these favorability of thoughts lead to policy support. So these can explain differences in the effects of climate science messages and policy support. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I'm not going to go into that because it is more complicated. You can read the paper if it gets published. So anyways, so this is the process. So the idea is the NOMBA effect can actually, you can overcome it, and in part because it's making people differentiate between good messages as supportive, strong messages, and those that aren't supportive. And so it does matter in a sense. That means that when it's a NOMBA effect, you need to really be careful about what you say. So in summary, across these things, policy attributes do affect the policy support. And that is what we had, the who is targeted, how is it targeted, and what are you targeting matters. And so it's and understand what are these attributes that matter as you're trying to design a policy. And they matter because of the consequences. So you can also try and address people's thoughts about policies based upon some of their consequences. And interestingly, these sorts of different qualities have the potential to affect how they process the information that you give them as well. So what just to go a little bit in terms of future research, one of the things that we're interested in is the who, the what, and the how. They represent, three of these questions that people are, if you're telling a story, you've got the who, what, where, when, why, and how. The where is one of the things we've studied a fair amount, the NIMBY effect, not in my backyard effect. But it might be useful to think about these sorts of questions, because these are the sorts of questions people might be asking when they look at a policy. And they might interact with each other, which is what we found. And so it starts moving into what you might call a storytelling model. So if you're going to tell a story about a policy, a journalist knows that you're trying to answer these sorts of questions. And so these are the sorts of questions that you might need to be addressing when you think about policies. We don't actually know about all of these, but that's our idea. But there's research that suggests is when is it now or later? Is it in my community somewhere else? Why? But they haven't been systematically studied. And so when we think it might be useful to think about policies along these different questions. The other thing we're looking about is so we ask people about social, economic, and what do people think about on their own without us prompting them to think about those things, change. And one of the things I'm working with some people in France who have been doing research in terms of what they're calling ecosystem services versus disservices. And so what do people, when you ask people about what is the consequence of a policy, what are they thinking of? Or even just land use change, but we're going to do both of those things. But ecosystem services, there's a lot of research and a lot of ideas that actually try and measure different types of services. And they tend to be what we might call biospheric, that they're actually about what happens to animals and plants, human impacts, the resources that we use. More recently, people have been talking about cultural impacts. So does there any change people's cultural tendencies, cultural patterns, their relationship with nature? And so we're interested in what do people come up with on their own and thinking about them in terms of the ecosystem services and disservices. We haven't done that research yet, but that's where we're going. And the other is getting back to some of the psychological things, is what do people, when you give these consequences, what is the emotional reaction? And both of the consequences of the policies, are they hopeful about them? Are they worried? Are they angry? Or are they just bored? And so these sorts of emotional responses, some other research we have suggest the emotional responses to a possible solution can be an important thing, not just emotional responses to climate change. I'm worried about climate change, no, but I'm worried about the policy, or am I worried about the concept of the policy? So we want to look into some of these emotional responses. So that's where we're going. And I can ask any questions now that you might have.
Janet, thank you. That was really interesting, and I love the way you broke down the various aspects of policies that people might be thinking about. There was some interesting comments in the chat about how this is really interesting research and that this is quite educational. I'm going to move into some of the questions. There was two questions relatively similar. You know, it's very clear from the series of studies that there's this not out of my bank account effect, that people don't like disincentives. They don't like it when especially don't like it when they're disincentives to them personally. But are the policies effective? So what I'm saying is this a case where we need to change the policy because people don't like them, or change the people because the policies are effective and we need to convince people to start liking them more?
That's a really good question, because some of it is, do you cave to people? So if it's the case that a disincentive actually has a bigger impact, you might just say, we're just going to do it and people aren't going to like it. But then you are going to get resistance, right? So if you use an incentive, you're not going to. But kind of what I think is interesting about that is that it's also an incentive may be effective. I think this may be one of the things I've been thinking about. It may be effective because people think they don't have to do it then. So if you give an incentive, they say, oh, I don't need that, so I'm not going to do it. And so they like a policy that they can reject. That's not going to hurt them to reject it. And so in that case, you might want to go to a disincentive because they're not going to do it. And I think that is a real dilemma to try and figure it out. And so some of it might be that it's kind of like a behavioral change in some sense. You need to focus in on it. Says you have to pick the right disincentive. So that's one of the things I think is one of the complicated things in our study is that the size of the green fee might matter in terms of how much people reject it. So if you give people $1, going to cost, if everybody Penn State student gives it $1, they say, oh, whatever, I'll give you $1. But we said 40, we thought it might be about $40. I said, no, wait, no. So it is going more into how much of a disincentive will get you a change versus how much will you get reactance from it. And so I think it is going more along that lines of really understanding how people are responding to the policy and what is your leeway in terms of implementing it. Is it enough to create a change versus how much will people react against it?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nicole Hebert, for that question. Carolee has a question. What about framing policies differently? So, to the extent that we can just talk about them differently, how does that affect? And she also asks, what's known about gender differences with regards to ecosystem services? Do you have any comments on gender differences?
Okay. So yeah, framing them differently. And so right now, most of the research on framing does matter, but that tends to be framing in terms of will you support something versus not support it. And so do you frame something? So typically people think now, they don't think future. So some of the framing is that, well, it might cost you now, but it's going to save you money later. And so you frame it in a way that people take into account that future benefit. So framing can matter. We know on policies in general, but so that sort of framing, I think, is part of the persuasive message to know if that's the thing that people are objecting to, if it's really the incentives problem, then you can frame it in a way that says, well, you may think about it as a cost, but actually there's a benefit later. So you can use that information that you know about why it matters. And I say that because some of the framing research is about the environmental costs now versus, or benefits now versus environmental costs later. And so there's still that emphasis on the environment, but you need to shift it over to more about people and the economics. And in some sense, it's back to the protests. It says you need to stop shouting at people about the environment when people say, we get it, but we don't like these other things. And so, yeah, I think framing can be really important in terms of accepting an attribute that people don't like. Well, and gender differences.
Yes, gender differences. Any comments there?
Yeah, so when I first started this research, I was actually in these policies. It was part of a grant about gender difference, because I thought there might be some gender differences in the assessment of these consequences, or not the consequences, but the importance of those different consequences. And we didn't find any of that. So these are part of a grant on masculinity, on supporting policy. We didn't find it. And I think the ecosystem services, I don't know. So we've recently started measuring different types of ecosystem services, and that in terms of environmental concerns, you generally find that women are more concerned about different environmental consequences. But I don't know when you get down to the policies themselves. So again, there was we didn't get an interaction even on political beliefs and these policy attributes. So when you get people to start thinking about the policies, some of these bigger things, bigger general points, individual differences don't matter as much, that people have similar responses. And so I think gender differences is an open question in terms of even the things that women and men might pay attention to. We do find somewhere else in terms of framing that women, we frame some arguments for a particular policy in terms of whether or not you would be a leader. So we use gender framing, that passing this policy is important for leadership, to lead the world, or passing this policy is important for justice reasons, or actually not passing. We had balanced it, and women were equally persuaded by each one of them, but men were persuaded more by leadership than justice. So that study preceded this. That study preceded this one, which is where we thought we'd get gender differences. We didn't in this one. But no, I think gender is a potentially important thing, but it really, again, I'd want to get down to the specific policy itself. And we might put more on that than we need to. It may be this main effect, but rank ordering the policies is a bit different.
Thanks. I'm conscious of the time. We have about 7 minutes left, but there's still a few questions here. This comes from Susan Schneider at Root Solutions. She was wondering if maybe you could provide an example of a successful campaign that took advantage of some of these principles to support these specific policies. And then, as a further question, could we scale up those things that have been successful? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would love to know one. Know a specific campaign. I think that would be really great. And that was where we'd like to actually go. So when we're looking at what I said, our research is going into land use change and policies for land use change. This is a 3-year project where we're going to be looking at what can we do in terms of communicating about particular policies and supporting them. So I hope in 3 years you can ask me that question again, and I can give you it. So I don't see people doing at that policy level. And if somebody else has an example of it, I would love to hear it. But we are trying to learn about what it is that people's resistances are, and so then we can then communicate better, both with them and the scientists and the policymakers. So we're trying to have more of an interaction amongst a whole bunch of stakeholders. So I'm sorry I can't answer that, but I would love to.
All right, this question comes from Kara Skipper, the Maryland Department of, I can't see what she's the Department of, but Kara asks, what are the strategies for convincing people to conduct behavioral change will not receive the benefits So, for example, upland polluters who don't experience the benefits of clean water downstream, how do you convince them to, go along and adopt the policies or accept them or support them?
Well, I think this is where I would probably think about, the psychological connections that you can create between people upstream and downstream. So that's one of the things that we're interested in this land use changes. And one of the things we've been proposing is that people will think about the effects of water now around them, but if they don't necessarily think about the effects that they have on water downstream. But if you can make them feel or think about the connections they have with those people who are downstream, they may be out-group members, but this is where I think a lot of the research on intergroup relationship is really important. That how do you get people to care about people who are not members of your own group? So that's, the more similarity you can make between yourself and another group, the more you bring them into your group. So so we all, Jack Davidio's work, and I'm blanking on the other person, but the multiple groups. So we belong to subgroups, but we also belong to higher order groups. And so if we can emphasize the higher order groups that we belong to, then we might feel more connected to other people and then have those connections. Or just as intergroup contact. And so intergroup contact, you can decrease prejudice and discrimination through intergroup contact, but you can also decrease it through friends who know people. A friend of my friends is in that group. So I think we can do a lot of things to make people feel more connected to other people who are experiencing the consequences of our action, and to turn to that research on intergroup relationships.
Yeah, I think that the superordinate group research is very interesting, as is generally in-group, out-group research. Tia Turner asks, since the U.S. is more individualistic with culture compared to other countries, do you think that increasing people's sense of ownership over the natural environment would decrease resistance?
I think...
I realize this, yeah, go ahead.
No, I think it's really interesting, and my first response is yes. Although I think that this is back to the sort of ecosystem services we're trying to split out between, there's one type of ecosystem services that's the thing that I get from the environment. And that actually our research preliminaries say, then therefore I can dominate it and use it. But if you have people think about it in terms of these cultural connections, the history of, even what your family might do out there, or the relationship you might have because of traditions and connections like place attachment. And so that's a different sort of ownership. It's more a relationship ownership than a material ownership. And that sort of relationship connection is important. So I think that it depends on what you mean by sort of ownership. It really is, you don't own your partner, but you do have a relationship with them. And so it is a more collectivist sort of social thing, but it's not, but it is still kind of my personal relationship with the environment is important. I hesitate somewhat because there's just this paper and then came out that individualism is not necessarily as bad as we might think it is, that individualism can actually make people feel individually responsible for doing something. And
yeah, you must be the hero to save the environment.
Yeah, sort of thing, right, that you can do this. Well, actually, I say you can do it, but it's really we can do this. And once we can do it, you can do it as well. So get the collective part that facilitates the individual. So some of my original research was that the United States, people in the United States are less likely to do behavioral change than other countries like Germany because of individualism. But that might be there might be a lot more nuances to that.
Thank you, Janet. We're right up to the very end. I have one more question I wonder if you can comment on really quickly, and then we'll call it. Janet, also, before I go, can you provide your email address that I could put in the chat? Because there's a few questions that didn't get answered, and I wonder if people could reach out to you directly.
Sure. It's jswim@psu.edu. Yep. So just
psu.edu. Yeah. That's very easy. So if you didn't get your question answered, you can reach out to Janet directly. And the last question here is Nat Treadway at DEFG asks, just to follow up on our previous discussion of whether we change the policies or change the people, he's wondering, is it even possible to change people, or are we talking about changing messages towards the people? Any thoughts on that before we go?
That's a really nice framing, because it's people do change, but it's harder and it's a longer term. And so that's really is the sort of target marketing. And so do we market towards certain people with certain messages? And so, but I still would like to go back to the framing of the messages about the policy, not necessarily about climate change. So, and when you get to the policy level, it's less about changing people than it is changing people's perceptions of the policies. Right.
Thanks, Janet. Very succinct. And again, thanks so much for taking the time to present it on today's webinar. Before we go, I just want to point out that we have a workshop, a small group workshop coming up June 17th. So keep your eyes peeled to the BECC website and your emails for all the information about that. It will be limited enrollment, so sign up when you see the email. And of course, the BECC conference is coming up, so please register at the early bird rate as soon as you can. And I think that is it for us for today. You'll get the recording of today's webinar will be posted on our website and I believe our YouTube channel as soon as possible. You should also get an email about it, but check back to our website regularly. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and thanks, Janet, for this really engaging and interesting talk.